right. See, Facebook was trying to try us, but not today. Not today.
We
Hey,
made it.
Marcella.
Hi, Elaine. Hi, everyone.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for this conversation.
Me too. I'm a little nervous, not gonna lie, but here we go.
Is this your first Facebook Live?
It is.
Ooh, well, this is going to be juicy, okay? The real talk is going to be popping off, no doubt. So I'm so excited. And hey, everyone, as you're joining us, we were having a little technical difficulties, but we are here and so excited to have you join us. We are go ahead and drop some hellos in the chat. We're going to dive in today's conversation, which is about imposter syndrome and what is it, how to navigate it, how to combat it. And so it's going to get real. And so we are so honored that you are joining us. And so thank you for being here today. And Marcella, I'm so excited that you are the special guest to
Brr,
be
brr, brr, brr.
I love our conversation. So I feel like having this live is probably just like a continuation of the combos we typically have on a daily basis. So it's always very deep too. We get really vulnerable. So
Oh,
thank you for
yes.
coming in here with that type of reflective energy. And thank you all for honoring that too, because we are, always leaning into that human part of who we are. So I'm here for it, but let's see. So we already have some people joining us. Welcome, Bibi and Emily and Esperanza and Anna. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to start off with actually having Marcella introduce herself and tell us a little bit about who she is, where she's from, and a little bit about her journey. And then I'll do the same, and then we'll dive in. So go
Sounds
for it,
good.
Marcella. Tell us who you are.
So hi everyone. My name is Marcela Torres Cervantes. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently the assistant director for the Carolina Latinx Center at Carolina. I started that exactly 1 month ago today. So today is my 1 month anniversary. So I'm excited to get to be working at Carolina. Prior to that, I spent 3 years at NC State working in their multicultural student affairs office. So shout out to MSA. Love them. Love that experience. And I am a very proud North Carolinian. I was raised in Sampson County, North Carolina, so Clinton, small town, huge immigrant population, and I've recently found out one of two of the largest Latinx population counties in the state, in the whole state. So we're really like pushing through. We have a lot of representation in the Southeast, a lot of migrant farm workers. And so it's been really neat to kind of be part of the generation that was there before that. And now going back and seeing, we have a Latinx grocery store now, like it's just like life changing. So that's been really cool. But yeah, I think that's a little bit about me, Mexican roots, from Monterrey. And so I was born there, but raised here in North Carolina. But yeah, I think that's a little bit about me. I love education. Higher education has always been kind of my sweet spot, working with young people, college age students, really getting them through college, enjoying college, students of color in particular. And so I'm excited to kind of talk about this through the lens of even what that has been and like what I've heard from other students. So really, really excited to be here.
Yay. Well, thank you. Already I'm learning new things about you. I'm like, wait a minute, this is good. So I'll introduce myself and we'll dive in to today. But first off, hi everyone. My name is Elaine Townsend Uten. I'm one of the co-founders, co-executive directors of Latinx Ed, and I'll explain a little bit more about what Latinx Ed is in a second. But I'm originally from Peru. Was born there in Lima and came over when I was really young, though, and so pretty much raised in the South. So Georgia, Arkansas, North Carolina, but North Carolina being home for the longest. And part of that journey of growing up, and as we're diving into today's conversation about imposter syndrome, it was really challenging to figure out where I belonged growing up. I feel like that was like a trend, if you will, or something that I was always thinking about. It was like, where do I fit, and like who can I connect with? Just feeling like I was a part of multiple worlds, but they never really collided
Mm-hmm.
really neatly. So
Yeah.
it was tricky to trying to figure that out. And so I feel like the next part is like my journey in education and trying to figure out how to navigate higher education in particular. So being a first generation college student, something very new for me and my family. And UNC was where I started for undergrad, and those feelings were very much like strong at UNC too, of feeling like, do I belong here? Is this meant for me? we'll unpack more and kind of why, but it definitely, that was a part of the journey. I don't think I had the language for it when I was at UNC. I think I learned more about what imposter syndrome was kind of when I was headed into grad school at Harvard in particular. That's when I felt like, okay, yeah, this is what I'm struggling with. And those feelings came with me to Harvard. But I'm really grateful to have such a incredible network of people in my life that were really able to help me also combat those feelings, and was able to find community in each of those spaces that really helped combat that process. So that's a little bit about me living that first gen life still always, but also the being a 1.75 generation immigrant has also really much factored into kind of how I navigate spaces and the lens that I have.
Sorry.
So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. We'll definitely dive a little bit more into our stories as we unpack today. But before we dive into some of the questions that we've also prepared, I do want to share a little bit about our work. And if you're interested in supporting, please come join us. There's a room for you in our movement. And then we'd love to also learn a little bit more about Marcela's work. So today I'm representing Latinx Ed. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to amplifying the lived experiences of Latinx immigrant families to break down educational barriers here in North Carolina. So that is what we're committed to. We manifest this through our work with multiple initiatives, whether that's through centering positive racial ethnic identity development, college access for Latinx youth, but also working with adults to figure out how do we design and create inclusive, equitable learning spaces for Latinx youth in particular. And one of the values that we very much hold to heart, and I think this is going to manifest in this conversation, is soy de aquí y soy de allá. That is what we're working towards with our youth, and making sure that our students feel like they are from here and they are from where their families are from or where they're from, and that they can be a part of both. And that is something that is part of who we are, humanity. It is complex, but we're working towards that feeling that, yes, I belong. And so that's something that we value as an organization. That's what we do in our work. So if that resonates with you, and also this conversation, feel free to go ahead and slide a few coins our way, give us a little tip. We'd love to ask for your support and financially also sustaining this vision and this mission that is very much needed in our state. So it's my shameless plug, and thank you for being here. And Marcela, tell us about your work and your new role, which is very exciting.
Yes, yes, yes. And so I talked about it a little bit, but I also first generation, but like first generation American college. So both my parents went to college in Mexico, but that system is much more reflective of our community college system here. You go to college kind of close to home, you can live at home, and it's definitely much more of a commuter space. It's not like an investment like it is here. So going through college, and then I chose to go to a private school. So that was also me navigating what that looks like as opposed to an in-state school. So I went to school in DC. So that was definitely a learning experience for me. So similar to what you were sharing, I've always been really curious about spaces of belonging and making sure that even though these institutions were not made for us in mind, right? The founders of Carolina never thought there would be a Carolina Latinx Center, right? Like, what? Maybe a Hispanic Center, but a Latinx Center? What? So radical. And so, right, it's really exciting. So my work has always been around supporting and encouraging students of color, and now more in particular, the Latinx student populations, on making sure that they find a space on campus where they can kind of take it off. So what I mean by that is, a lot of the times, and even in talking with this imposter syndrome conversation, I know maybe you can relate to this, but it's this feeling of like, I have to be the best, I have to be performing, I have to be on, because I'm representing me, I'm representing my family, I'm representing my culture. And so it's this like kind of mosh podge of like the unseen knapsack that we're all carrying, right? Of like these pressures and these peoples in this society. And so what is it to find a space on campus where you can just take all of that off and just exist? And not only that, but have somewhere that affirms you. And so that's what I get really excited about when working in multicultural spaces, identity spaces, and now Carolina Latinx Center, where, we're really building this venture from the ground up and getting to really say, it had been this collective at Carolina for like 10 years, this idea of a collaborative, but now there's like a building, there's doors, there's a couch, like there's places for people to come sit and build that community, right? And so I'm really, really excited. I know that COVID has really thrown a wrench in some of the things because we're social people in person, but excited for what community we can still kind of continue to build. And not just for the students, right? Their family members. I always say we never recruit a Latinx student to any college. We recruit the whole family and sometimes the neighborhood. So like making sure that we're making it an inviting space for families, for neighbors, for grandparents, for the community, for the local, folks in Chapel Hill who are raised around the Orange County area should know that UNC is also a place for them. It's not just for this like elite academic environment. It's a community space for all. So yeah, that's kind of what we're doing and kind of getting to build that out.
That is so exciting. And I'm so excited that you are the brand new addition to the center. I feel like that's huge as we create spaces where students feel like they belong, especially on campus. And so already I'm seeing in the chat some love for the Latinx Center. Let's go. Maida,
Hey.
through. We also see some other people joining us. So hello. Kayla is here, and same with Parker, and oh my gosh, the list keeps going. Jasmine, what's up? Jenna, welcome. Ben, Valentina too. I mean, oh my goodness, the crew is here. Okay, so this is awesome to also learn about more resources too that are on campus, especially since we have a lot of students tuning in. So I'm just really pumped about that. And so to everyone in the chat coming through now, we are excited to hear your questions too. If you have anything as we are talking, if anything sparks, or you're like, wait, what do y'all think about this? I'm trying to pay attention to the chat. Okay. So I'm going to try to incorporate what you are thinking or what you're asking into this conversation. So feel free to come through. And also shameless plug to Sydney. What's up, Sydney? Welcome. All right. So let's get started, Marcel. And let's start off. I love that you also do this in your work, but starting off with definitions and like what things are and kind of trying to create a shared language. So starting off with imposter syndrome, what is it? How would you define it?
Ooh, great question. So I'm sure that it's something that folks, well, not even sure, let me not do that. So when people hear imposter syndrome, they're like, okay, imposter, they think of someone wearing a mask, right? It's kind of this double identity. But it's a psychological thing. It's for real, right? It's something that, the scientists, the PhDs have studied, and it's very much this feeling of, whatever it is that you're doing, you're actually not meant to be there for real, right? It's kind of this like secret voice in your head that's like, I feel like I'm just pretending. Everyone else really deserves to be here. So that manifests itself in different ways. But in a college environment, that might be, ooh, I don't know if they meant to admit me here. My grades aren't as good, or I don't think I'm as smart, or those types of things. So, but they let me in. So let me try and live up to this idea of who I am because I have to pretend, and hopefully I don't get caught. So what that does to you is A, it makes you doubt yourself. B, it makes you feel like you're having to, again, put on something that isn't a reality. And then C, that always makes you feel like that added pressure of anytime that you fail or stumble even, you're like, oh, see, I knew it. I wasn't meant to be here. And so it just like double compounds kind of that stress of what you're experiencing. And so some people can be very confident and they're like, no, I deserve, I belong, I'm supposed to be here. Yes, but whether it's the visuals that we see, whether it's, the communities that are or aren't present, there's ways in which we kind of start kind of feeling this way of like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be here, and I think I'm going to get caught and I'm going to get called out and they're going to kick me out of school. Or with our identities, right? It's, oh, I'm not Mexican enough, so they're actually going to take away my Mexican card. So I can't claim it anymore if people find out I don't like that artist or I don't like that food or whatever, right? So there's ways in which it shows up and we almost feel like we have to hide truth in order to do that. But we all know now, like, right, whenever we're able to kind of take the emotions out of it, all of that isn't true, right? All of us deserve to be exactly where we are, but there's ways in which we kind of have that kind of feeling that hovers over us and those pressures.
That is such a good summary too. I think the piece that imposter syndrome is very much rooted in doubt and also fear. It helps us get to the core of the voice that is in the head, right? Those automatic negative thoughts that sneak in there and tell you that you're less than. And when you were talking about your work with the Carolina Latinx Center, I think something that really stood out to me is we were saying that our work, where is our worth? Our worth being in our existence, in the fact that we exist, and that piece that sometimes the worth gets wrapped up into the pressures that be of being this whatever you have in your head as this learner or this leader or this person that is supposed to carry the entire weight of the world. It's that those feelings get kind of wrapped up, but also I think that's where our self-worth starts to get tangled into
Right.
how we perform or what
Right.
we're able to produce or what our interests, our likes, who we are personality wise. Even it can get really complicated that way. So I guess diving into the personal kind of piece of this conversation too is how is imposter syndrome showed up in your journey? What does that look like?
Whew. So your class and I had the opportunity to kind of delve into the different types of imposter syndrome that exist. And I'll say that there's one that's called like the expert. And so that's a person that almost like over educates themselves on any topic, but still feels like they don't know enough. So they have to continuously learn. So whenever we're talking about like our identities, I think that was something that I even like put on as a small child, where I was in school and at home, we would always speak Spanish. And I would go to pre-K or kindergarten, and again, everything was in English, and everything was, in a Southern accent, if anything, right? So it wasn't just standard English, right? It's Clinton English. And so I remember thinking, like, whenever I would talk and I would speak with an accent or I wouldn't have all the right words, I was feeling really overwhelmed. So there was like 6 months where I didn't speak at school, but I was listening and I was hearing, because I was like, how do I say these words? How do I express myself? Because I remember there was one day that I was trying to ask for glue, but I couldn't remember the word for glue. And so I just kept like trying to say it and she wouldn't understand me. And so I just started crying because I was like, you don't understand. You don't understand. So then I just like learned as much vocabulary as I could, because I wanted to like be able to navigate a space where I could just like push through and no one would know. It felt like if I knew enough, I could actually hide that I was different. And so I felt like that has been something that I followed me my whole life, whether it was being Mexican in a very predominantly white town where it was like, let me pretend to be as Southern or as North Carolinian or as white or as American as possible. Maybe I can sneak through. Or then when I went to, college, it was like everyone here like knows how to do college already. So like me too. And really I'd watched like every teen movie possible on the college experience and had like done as much like research as I could by like scrolling through other people's Facebooks and just kind of being like, okay, so people go to parties and there's red cups. So let me make sure that if I go to a party, I find the red cup. Like there was just little like cultural nuances that I became obsessed with, like kind of fitting in. And then if anyone ever was like, oh, how did you know to do that? It was like, that's just what you do. Even though it was like, because I tried really, really hard. Right. And so people often forget that I'm first generation American in a lot of ways, because they're like, you just blend right in. And I'm like, yeah, because I've been working my whole life to kind of blend in. But in reality, like, if there's been so many times where I'll be talking to someone and they'll reference a movie or some genre of music, and I'm just like, I have never heard of that before. Or idioms. We were talking about idioms yesterday. They'll make some statement like the phrase, I threw a wrench in it. I remember the first time I heard someone say that, and I was like, what does that mean? Like, why are you throwing wrenches? And because it was just not something that I had heard before. So there's definitely ways in which my whole life I have been almost like studying people so that they wouldn't know that I was different or that I didn't belong.
That last part, wow, studying others to figure out how to fit in. And where, oh my goodness, Marcel, that was so deep. That threw me to my own journey. I feel like of trying to fit in. My journey is also nuanced when we talk about my childhood. That is a whole nother capacito. But it still is relevant for this one in a way of thinking of like, I was raised in South Georgia, like South Georgia. So people who are from Georgia, maybe someone from Atlanta, like they even don't know about where I'm from. Like South Georgia is really in like, in it's out there. It's very rural. And also like behind the times. Like it feels like in 2013, the county right next to mine had its first non-segregated prom. 2013. And I'm like,
Wow.
that is, I remember, I heard about that. I was not surprised, because that's how it felt growing up. It felt like we were really behind the times when it came to race relations, you name it, right? But it was also strange to kind of grow up like that too, and not feeling really connected to yourself and who you were. And so then I went to Arkansas, another very rural space in like a dairy farm, and in the Ozark Mountains, and like what, like that's my life. But coming to North Carolina was a really big deal for me. And I went to my first kind of like big quote unquote school. It wasn't big at all. My class was like 60 when I joined, probably. People out here going to class with like hundreds of people, and I'm like, what? So for me it was huge, going from like a really small classroom to a really big classroom. And I remember day one, I was so lost. And that was just, I couldn't find anything. I couldn't figure out where the gym was. I didn't have any friends. It was like, all of that anxiety that can build up from those kind of circumstances really felt strong. And then on top of that, I knew I was really weird. Like, I knew I just had all these quirks that no one really understood. That was just a reflection of the space I had been brought up in. And, kids that age, I was in middle school, but they can be really rough, and
Yeah.
jokes and teasing. And so I went through a lot of that in middle school. But at the same time, I think for what I was looking at people, I was like watching people and observing. And I felt like I could turn into this chameleon sometimes, where I would just like, I could fit in if I wanted to, because I was paying so much attention to how everybody
Right.
was operating. But to the point that I think I reflected this, especially in high school, I was having a hard time figuring out, but who am I? Like what, that is me navigating, and I can put on all these different personas, but who am I truly inside? And I remember feeling really disconnected from that, and who I was inside, but also who I wanted to be. It was
Mm.
a really confusing time. And getting to college, I was super excited because I was in predominantly white spaces. So I was really eager to connect with other Latinos, Latinas. I was ready to connect, finally have a community. And I remember going to UNC, I heard about at the time Chispa, the Carolina Hispanic Association, which is now Mi Pueblo. And I was like, this is gonna be my spot. Like, I can't wait. I was so excited to meet people. And at the time that I joined, it was tricky, because it did feel like it was a little bit cliquey, and that there was I felt like I needed a password to get in, and I didn't know what the password was. And then I was also really self-conscious about my Spanish, because that was always, just growing up in a predominantly English setting, like that wasn't my strength. And so I just felt like, I just remember feeling like I remember feeling less Latina. Like, I felt like maybe I can't claim this, but I knowing that was my background, and that was my heritage too. It just felt really hard to connect to that. And that was part of the journey, I think, when it comes to the identity side. And then academically going through it as well, feeling, oh my gosh, my first year at UNC, I came from high school being a valedictorian and got to UNC my first year, and I felt like I was going to drop out. Like, that's how it felt. Like, it was such a harsh reality. And if I think
Yeah.
back, I totally can pinpoint why. Even know what AP credits were. I remember coming into orientation, they were like, so how many AP credits do you have? I was like, AP, what is that? Because we did not have advanced placement in my high school. And the kid beside me, right, was like, oh, I have 21. And I'm like, how did you get these credits? And what does this mean? I just remember totally feeling like completely like a fish out of water. And that was just the whole experience. My first year was just taking the wrong classes, like making every rookie mistake that's in the first gen handbook.
Oh, yes.
And it wasn't until, and I guess this is where we can start talking about maybe how we figured out some ways to cope too. But for me, it was not trying to find that support network, and trying to find other people that could understand what I was going through. And I don't know if that really happened until maybe even my junior year in college, where we joined the same sorority in different campuses. But for me, I joined the sorority, a Latina-based sorority, Latinas Promoviendo Comunidad Lambda Pi Chi Sorority Incorporated. Okay, but that for me was like the first time I found other women too, that we could have a really deep relationship and be able to unpack what we were going through as college students together, and really be able to also feel like we could center community and culture and our hermandad, who we were in our relationships. And that was a really healing process for me. And so I'm curious to kind of throw it back to you, like what were some of the kind of ways that you figured out also how to cope or to navigate or combat?
Yeah, I think for me, it's honestly a continuous struggle, because I think another part, a facet of imposter syndrome, is just like perfectionism. It's this all or nothing mentality of, again, because you feel like an imposter, any slight mistake that you make, you're feeding into this like idea of I don't belong or what have you, or, you don't give yourself permission to stumble, right? Which is absolutely so silly, because we all have to try to practice to learn, but we want to another one of the types was being naturally, a natural genius. So a lot of us growing up were just called smart, like, oh yeah, you're smart. So then asking questions, you feel like a dumb person, right? Which, to put it in very plain terms, you're like, well, I'm a smart person, so I shouldn't ask questions. When in reality, as I've gotten older, it's been like, actually the smartest people ask the most questions. the smartest people are the most curious and want to like unpack and understand more. And also the smartest people depend on what room you're in, right? And so being able to actually get into those rooms, right? For me, it was really important to, go to school out of state, be at this private school in DC. And while I was in those spaces thinking like, oh, like I'm going to meet like such brilliant people here because, they're also in this environment, and being like, y'all are so normal, right? Like the more that you got to know them, it's like you are, yes, brilliant in some ways, and other ways not so much, right? Like I think for me, it's been really affirming. I read a lot of memoirs. And so especially like women of color memoirs, when they say like, we hustle so hard to get into these high elite spaces, Michelle Obama's book talked a lot about it, but then you walk into those rooms and you're like, this looks just like that room I was in. It's just, this one has the label of Ivy League. This one has the label of college or, ivory tower, but it's just the same as this, but it just has that access. So like the more that I'm able to like take things off pedestals, and then that's when I'm like, because everyone is normal, I too I can be flawed and be here because everyone else here is flawed, right? And if anything, then actually being able to confidently talk about like, and I'm a smart person and I'm able to meet and these people and challenge them and be like a peer to them, as opposed to like, oh my gosh, could I ever, right? And I talk a lot about being a little sister, and I think that was also a really big thing for me growing up, where I was always looking up to my older brothers, and so I always look up to mentors, or I look up to supervisors or whatever, thinking like, will I ever get there? And the more that I'm able to humanize and bring down and kind of think like, I'm already here, let me stop trying to like, it's good to have goals and it's good to be an achiever, of course, but I think that there's a way in which I have to stop idealizing what could be, and more so being accepting and present with what is, because then I see how I belong in what is, as opposed to this fantasy world. So that's been a really big thing to me, where a lot of times I just have to like stop and think like, they're not God, right? It's like they're not untouchable. Like those things don't exist. Actually, if you talk to most people, they're just like you and I. They just had access to different things. And so that's just kind of what's been helpful for me, of like, okay, so what does this person have to teach me? And that's with anybody. And then what's my gifts? What are my gifts? How can I share those out? And so that's been a really big thing of like really honing in on what those things are and being able to say those without having the qualifiers of like I'm not that good. No, like I actually have to say like I am good at this and this is what I'm proud of, right? And so that's hard, and it's really hard to claim without feeling like an imposter, but like the more they're able to say, well, I'm not going for perfection, I'm just going for good for me, right? And so that's really important too.
Mm. I really feel everything you just dropped, and so does the chat. Okay, a lot of love here. And I there's one thing that also really stood out from what you were saying too, and for me, it's this piece about truth telling too, and how often when those thoughts come in that are not truths, those are lies, though, that you are not worthy, that you do not have value, those are lies. That is not the truth, right? And when we allow those thoughts to create a home in our head, how
Mhm.
damaging that can be. But the fact that we have power, uh, and we can, I mean, it takes process to really access and unleash that power, right? I feel like that's part of the journey that we're all going through, of trying to also heal the trauma, right? To be able to get to the truth and to
Right.
get to the essence of who you are and really lean into that. This piece about truth telling is such an important part of that process, to when that automatic negative thought sneaks in there and starts to tell you that you're less than, to be like, boom, I was ready for you. Nope, that's not the truth, and the truth is whatever, that I am worthy, that I am valuable.
Mhm.
And something that I did in a coaching experience that really helped me also understand how I could examine myself and really increase my self-awareness was Dr. Anise, who's been on a cafecito before, kind of gave me this exercise of like, when you start to feel certain emotions, and specifically emotions that are connected to fear and doubt. So maybe that's you're feeling anxious, you're feeling, angry or frustrated. They're the ones that kind of manifest in that lane. To take a second and to just record what's happening, like to literally record the thought that's coming in your mind. And I remember when for me, the thought that kept coming into my mind was this fear of failure, and this fear of like, of letting people down and all of this stuff. And so I started writing it down down when those thoughts would come in. And then she was like, okay, so as you're seeing what thoughts are coming in, and also most frequently, right? Sometimes we have some frequent flyers up in here that are coming through, and we can be able to look at ourselves even as data of like, I'm collecting data. This thought came to me 3 times this week, and already I know that this is not the truth. And so what is the truth? And literally writing it out. Maybe it's in your phone or in your notebook or whatnot, and writing the truth down. So when that frequent flyer, again, we're going to release that. That's the point, is to also, release those thoughts, but that you're prepared of like, when that thought comes in, it's like fear of failure. And like, no, what you're doing right now is going to give you growth. This is an opportunity for learning. We don't have to move in fear of failure, because we know that making mistakes is part of the process. And we know that we are, our worth is in our existence. It's not in how amazing we perform at this task. That is where we, and just start speaking that truth to self, to really connect us to our spirit. I feel like it's so important part of the process. And I really resonated with what you were sharing with that piece about just truth telling and combating those thoughts with the truth has been one of my strategies that has been hard, but it required me to take data literally to get in touch with self of like, what is happening frequently, and being able to do that. And that's something that we can all do. And I feel like that also comes back to that piece that we have the power within
Yeah,
ourselves.
even with what you're kind of saying too, I think that there's a way of like truth telling. One way that I've been able to do it is thinking like, okay, I don't want to apply to this job because I don't think I'm worthy of it, right? And then I think about it, I'm like, okay, what if I applied? Worst case scenario, what would happen? I don't get the job. Okay. If I'm not already applying to the job, I'm already living out my worst case scenario, right? Like there's ways in which even if you don't move, you're already playing into that worst thing because you just don't want to fail. But this way you can say like, well, I failed or I didn't get the job because I didn't even apply, as opposed to I didn't get the job because I applied and I didn't get it. But if you apply and don't get it, what you get from that is a learning experience. You get the actual experience of like, I applied, you maybe put your name out there and someone saw it and they could think of you for a different role. Maybe you can get feedback on it, right? Like there's things, and there's good in the falling if you actually think of it as, what is this experience trying to teach me, as opposed to why is this happening to me, right? And so being much more thoughtful of every no gives you so much history and knowledge so that you can be more prepared for your next yes, as opposed to just thinking like, I don't want to ever put myself in a situation where I get a no, because then you're never going to learn what it's like to have to like pick yourself back up in those spaces. Because I think, again, like what you're saying is so true. Like we get so paralyzed by this idea of we have to be strong, we have to be consistent. We see this Instagram view of everyone's life. So everyone gets into grad school, right? What they don't tell you is how many schools they got rejected to at the same time, right? What they don't tell you is how many times they got no's. But it's like knowing that like the highlight reel is great, but like from those things, it's so important to talk about like, yeah, I failed a class before. I've been there. Like, like I had to go through that. So I learned how to do it better. And I'm here to like kind of share and do that. So like, it's not a seamless journey, right? It's always easy to kind of talk about our accomplishments, but those accomplishments came from a lot of failures.
And just leading into that, and then that's the part of the process has been gold. I'm gonna actually pull it. Look at me, I'm paying attention to the chat. I'm very, yeah, let's go. Growth. Okay. I have a question from Alice here, who was saying, she was saying that, just asking about the difference between basic insecurities and imposter syndrome. I'm curious what you think about this too. Is there a distinction? What do you
That's
think?
interesting.
Isn't that an interesting question?
Yeah, and I feel like that's definitely something for someone that's a little bit more of a psych background, but I think for me they're intertwined in some ways. Especially imposter syndrome tends to be much more connected with our community and like our spaces of like our roles in life. So I think that's definitely has more to do with like my role as a student, my role in my profession, and even my role in my identity, right? Like that has more to do with like there's a community and there's people that are judging me, as opposed to like insecurities are more so like internal kind of like processing and like navigating. Even if no one else is judging you, you're kind of judging yourself. So that I think that's a little bit of a distinction there, but I feel like they manifest in similar ways of it holds you back from trying different things, because a lot of the times insecurities come from this belief that other people are doing it better than you, or there's a way in which you're admiring others, looking at other people's things, like the whole idea of comparing yourself to someone else, you've already kind of like lost the joy because you're too busy looking at someone else's paper as opposed to your own. So I think there's ways in which that can also be kind of linked. But yeah, what do you think about that?
I love how you're unpacking that too. I feel like they have, to your point, similar roots. Like they're rooted in self-doubt or in fear. And I think a lot of our insecurities, and I'm just thinking about even mine, are usually based on other people's perception too, which is
Right.
also another overlap with imposter syndrome. So often worried and concerned about how other people perceive us, or maybe you're getting feedback. This is another thing I was thinking about, especially with students of color in particular, as we navigating spaces. We are experiencing also microaggressions, whether that's in the classroom or in other spaces. So that is where other people are putting something on you. Maybe they're critiquing you on how you dress or how you wore your hair or what earrings you're wearing or the accent that you have. I mean, these are all, and I guess this is where I'm maybe going a little off topic here, but it's all connected, But this, when we are not, I think for me, what's also helped with navigating imposter syndrome, and also to some extent insecurities too, is like what do I have control over, and also what I don't know, for me it comes back to truth too, because I'm like, if other people are saying these things, right, or they're critiquing me, what, or their actions, right, maybe it's not even words, maybe it's what they did or something like that, like those actions are a reflection of them, they are not a reflection of me. And that has released a lot of the things that I think my insecurities are also embedded in. Was maybe that at one point in my life somebody told me something about something they didn't like about me, or maybe it was something that, then I started to think, oh my gosh, is this true, when whatever that was a reflection of that person and their own experiences. And I think this was something my mom really tried to get into me, did not, get through until I was older. But like her thing of like, I remember feeling like I used to be really self-conscious about being called out or like kind of getting a lot of attention in spaces. And the principal, when I was in elementary, oh gosh, I've not told the story ever, but she like called, she made a joke. I did something, I think I like covered my mouth when I yawned. This is such a silly story, okay. All right, but I covered my mouth when I yawned, and she was like, oh, look at Elaine, she's covering her mouth when I was a very weird interaction actually, if I think back. But she was like, it was like the whole school, or it was a small school, but the whole school, and she kind of just put so much spotlight on me, and then she was trying to joke, it just went the wrong direction, right? And I remember coming home and I was like, Mom, like I can't believe this, she was, and also my friends were teasing me about that interaction, and she was like, is that true? And I was like, no. And she was like, so, are you going to let that be the truth? And I was like, no, but it still feels bad. I remember her trying to be like, listen to the truth, the truth and you have it within you. And I think that's resonating now as an adult. It's such a silly example, but it's one that, I come back to. Our most formative years are really that 0 to 8 and what goes down in that time period. And so I think that some of the insecurities, when I think about them critically, I'm like, yeah, they're definitely a reflection of incidences I've had with other people. And then now that I know the truth, right, that other people's actions are a reflection of them and not of me, I can release myself from whatever that was and whatever that lesson that I learned was, and recognize that it no longer serves me as I'm moving forward. And saying that it was in the past was a really important part of that too. So that was a juicy question, Alice. Thank you for bringing that in here. And let's see, some comments that are coming through. Juicy. Oh my goodness. Talking about the ego. Oof. The ego. Jenna it made a comment of not letting ego take over and tell us what we are not. The ego. Have you done a lot of ego work, or have you unpacked ego? Can you tell me, what have you been processing about the ego and its like intersection with imposter syndrome?
So I feel like ego is such an interesting, I know there's like the ego and the id and all of those things. And like, I honestly, I would have to like look at my my like little cheat sheet. So again, like imposter syndrome, I'm like, I don't want to claim expert here. But it's been a lot of, because there's ways in which like for example, you were valedictorian in your school, right? And so there's ways in which that you're an intelligent person. And there's ways in which we almost get told growing up, maybe it's being a woman of color, whatever, being an immigrant, but it's like, you have to stay humble. You can never claim to be bright and brilliant or what have you. And so there's times where I've gone to like other experts and they're trying to teach me something. And I'm like sitting there thinking, like, I could do this better than you. But it's almost this like conflict of like my ego being like, yeah, girl, you got this. But then my imposter syndrome being like, nah, girl, stop. So it's like, I don't know. Like, I get confused where it's like, I want to be bold and like, say something and be like, well, what about this? Or can like, that doesn't sound right. Or like, basically correct somebody. But then the imposter syndrome being like, no, like, you're probably wrong. You should double check it, like, take it in, like, all of those things. And then there's ways in which, like, at the same time, and that's with people with like authority, so you like don't want to correct someone that's older, that's like smarter than you or like has more authority than you. But then when it's your peers, it's almost this idea also of like, I have to do it perfectly and only I can do it perfectly, none of y'all can do it like I can, so I'm not going to ask for help, I'm not going to release any of the control because that doesn't make me feel safe. So about learning of like, I'm not the one that can do this, everyone can probably do this too, or I can help so that there be more people that learn how to do it. So it's very interesting dynamic of like how we talk to ourselves of like when we feel confident versus when we like, but does that confidence mean like you can do it alone, or does that are you confident enough to ask for help, right? Like I think that that's even its own conversation. So ego is something that I'm having a lot of like self conversations with, because I'm realizing now, like as I've gotten older, when I've let my ego get in the way, or when I've like had my ego almost like I shut it down, like I don't want it to be present because again of that like must be humble kind of like space. What do you think?
This is juicy. I would say I feel like I have more work to do and understanding how the ego really manifests. So I'm going to put that disclaimer there, just because it's actually something I'm thinking actively about. Um, but this piece about humility is really interesting because it does also take humility to ask questions. And I think you brought that up as like, that's one of the ways to also combat imposter syndrome too, of like being vulnerable and sharing your needs and allowing yourself to have the right to, need, that's part of
Right.
the way to combat it. And so humility can really manifest in a very positive way there. I think humility also, I think there's a light side to it and there's a shadow side to it, but for me, I feel like that for me, when I've allowed myself to be vulnerable, it has also meant that I am getting in touch with a humble space, that I am quieting the ego, that I am allowing my spirit to really lean into the right that I have to need others, to be able to ask questions, and that is a right that I have. And so, and that everybody has, right? And this piece though about the whole and bringing up the valedictorian thing, I remember I was, I had gone to that school that I was at for about 5 years, and I figured out a lot of the different ways to navigate the system, and I started excelling, right? I got just different accolades that on paper would make you think that I was very confident. But actually what was happening was I was still, it never was good enough. Like I also felt like there was always more, but also it just felt like the imposter syndrome was rampant there, of feeling like someone's going to find me out, right? Like that these are not things I deserve. When the truth was that I was working my butt off, and I was trying really hard, and I was also navigating a lot at home, and just everything, it was really, if I think back to it, I'm like, geez, that was really challenging, right? And I try to normalize it in my head that I was like, everybody's doing this, right? Everybody's going through these challenges, just to kind of try to keep myself sane a little bit. And then getting to the application process of applying to colleges, I really thought I wasn't going to get into college. I literally, that's such a bizarre thing that people don't really get sometimes, but I'm like, yes, I recognize I was all of these things that look really good on a resume, but I literally did not think I was going to get into college, just because I thought that I wasn't worth it, or I didn't deserve it, or that it would, like, that imposter piece would come out. And I remember my mom being like, what is wrong with you? Like, you have and her just trying to like constantly speak truth to me and be like, you need to believe in yourself, that you are capable of this, that you are, in her trying, me being so resistant, being that kid. But then when I got to UNC, and then being like, all of these great things happen, quote unquote, right, in high school. And now I'm really struggling in college as a first generation college student, not having the understanding of like even the larger cultural context, or even just the context of like first gen students in college and what that experience is like. I remember so much stress around that piece. And I'm trying to think of like if I could go back and what would be different. But honestly, I just feel like I needed to push through some of those experiences. And just, I think for me, okay, let me sum this up here. Here's what I'm trying to say is that for me, in that time where I was in that space, in those challenges, I did what I needed to do, which was show up. I literally, that was all I could do. I was just show up. Go to class was to show up. I mean, I felt like I was failing, but me just showing up, that's how I combated it in that time, was just to keep appearing and trying. In that way was me not giving up. Yeah, maybe, what I was producing, especially that first year of college, wasn't, anything to take home and put on the fridge. But, like for me, that the fact that I was showing up, I think if I think back, that's part of how I combated it, was just to keep going and try not to give up. And that was a really hard struggle. But I think that's something else that when you're in the thick of it and those feelings and those emotions are just so overwhelming, the fact that you are still showing up is a huge win. Like that is to be celebrated, that is to be honored. And that's something that I just think back to, and I was like, wow, that's how I got through it. That's how I got kind of pushed through it and kind of let things unravel. But that's just a little bit about me.
Do you think that, in kind of going on that and talking about ego too, are there ways that, like, I know for me, like when I was in college and I was having a rough time, there was even a part of me that was like, I was out of state, I was homesick, but I couldn't feel like I could tell people that I was homesick, because it was like, if I do, then I'm gonna fail, right? Like that was part of my ego too, where it was like, I made a big deal about wanting to leave North Carolina. I left it, here I am, and now I'm homesick. Like I felt like that was kind of, there was again that ego of like, no, I'm gonna push through. I'm gonna almost force myself to stay, right? Like I'm gonna stay here and show up. But there was a way that was like still a little bit of me being like, because to go back is to fail and I can't fail, right? Even though I think that there's ways in which, our community's Latinx identity tends to be much more communal, which is why the idea of going to a local college, it makes so much more sense for people of our identity that are used to being so much more connected to family. So it's like, that wouldn't have been a failure to have been close to home. It's just that I had made this like big thing in my own head and I didn't want to fail. So I was just like, no, I can't. Like I could not transfer to be closer to home. I couldn't do that, even though like maybe it would have been fine. But like, I forced myself and pushed myself, and it was still a really great experience. But I think there's definitely ways in which I think my imposter syndrome and my ego were definitely like present in a way that it was like, I won't ask for help in those ways too, because I'm trying to like push myself and show up, even though I could, there is another window here of like, I could move closer to home, but I didn't want to, right? Because I didn't want to be a failure to me.
That's so real. Oof. And Jenna just added a comment here, so I'm gonna read this comment. But she was adding some clarification what she was talking about ego, because I'm, like I said, I'm still unpacking ego. So thank you, Jenna, for coming through. So she said, when I say ego, I meant the ego that tries to protect you from real and perceived danger. So sometimes we tell ourselves that we are not good enough for XYZ or whatever the perceived danger is. And then we've had to say to our ego, stand back. I'm not in danger and I can do this. So she was just saying how she was appreciating how we talked about telling the negative talk in our head to take a seat. And
Mm,
in that piece of how our mind and ego, now kind of using that word there, is like, is how it works, is actively trying to protect us. And that's where we
yeah.
can add the compassion to this conversation of being compassionate to yourself, right? To your former self, to your current self, to your future self, because our minds and the way that they are designed is to protect us. And so the challenge of being in a cycle of socialization, right, that's rooted in fear and doubt, in ways that the society is also, right, socializing us through punitive things, where you're like, oh, if I do this, I'm going to be treated this way. Then we start to socialize ourselves. Then how do we move into that cycle of liberation, of really leaning into that self love, to that acceptance of self, to really trust ourselves too? I think that's when we learn how to also navigate that ego or the mind when it's trying to protect us, and being of like compassionately letting go of certain mindsets and going through that process of releasing it, but it compassionately knowing that that mindset was there at a certain time to protect you and to preserve you, and now it no longer serves you, and we can now compassionately and lovingly release that to then accept something that is now, you know, the direction that we need to head. So even an example for me is moving away from a fear of failure to moving into a mindset that is all about growth, and just thinking and trying to look at things and challenges and newness as this is an opportunity to learn something. And that already, it quiets all of the the fear that's, you know, that can be at the root, because I am then operating out of trust and love, not out of fear and doubt. And then
Right.
I can manifest so much more, and in a way that I love the process of it better too, than when I'm acting out of that side of life.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I think that that's what has become like a very popular phrase now amongst like people that work in this space of like abundance theory, right? As opposed to scarcity mindset, where this idea of we're able to like we can say yes to all of the great things in our life and then more, right? As opposed to thinking like we can only have a few. And so even that I think has been something that imposter syndrome was trying to like hold me back from, of like, okay, not only can there only be a few, right? Like first gen Latinas, then it's like, so anyone else is the competitor. And so this idea of like we have to compete with one another because there aren't that many spaces, as opposed to thinking, actually, if there's more of us, there's more room for us to have all of these different identities and all of these different ways of existing. So like we should make more room for us, as opposed to thinking like, you know, we only make up like what 10% of the campus population. And so I have to like be scrappy to like be a part of that 10%, as opposed to being like, well, what if we made up 12%, 15%? Like, you know, like we should be asking for more, as opposed to like settling and being okay and trying to like fight for scraps. So that's definitely something that I think imposter syndrome will make you think like I have to fight for a spot, as opposed to like with if and when you make it, because a lot of us do make it to college, to that award or whatever. Let me make sure that there's more people coming behind me, so that, you know, instead of like taking up the ladder with you and saying like, nope, it was just me and no one else can climb up here, thinking like, let me get a longer ladder so that even more people can come up, right?
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. And really just, I feel like for us too, as being Latinas, really centering the collective is just part of our nature too, in some way, in some ways, right? The way that we're raised, and to really value family and that connection and that, and those relationships that can manifest in the way of like turning around and opening the door for others and making sure that we're all collectively moving forward, is so powerful. So this last question, and then shameless plug to the audience out there, if you got any more questions, slide them in here because we are coming to time. But in my class, we've been talking about designing equitable, inclusive spaces for learning, and specifically for Latinx students. And so a question that I want to kind of tease out, and as we think about other people who are, maybe you're an educator, or maybe you're a facilitator, who knows, so education manifests in all fields, right? So, but we are creating spaces and learning environments for everybody. So what are some ideas that maybe you have for how educators or whoever's in that role can create a space that is intentionally combating imposter syndrome, and like how do we fight against it together collectively?
Yeah, I think I'm going to throw it back to what we started talking about, and being honest, right? Being truth tellers, where, you know, if it's a classroom, you know, being open and honest about what the expectations are, kind of, you know, telling, you know, affirm people like that they're meant to be there, right? Like, you know, really, you know, get rid of the hierarchy of like, you know, there's people in control here and they, you know, they have more authority to say than like those of you with like lower. And really having, you know, like switching the classroom dynamic from like a lecture style to a circle style to discussion to that egalitarian idea of like we all bring in our own perspective, so we're all constantly learning, right? Like you and I have both been able to teach classes in the past, and I know that after every class you walk away also learning more than when you started, because your students are also teaching you, right? And like normalizing that conversation with them of like, you are a scholar, and so you are also the educator and you are teaching me. And so like really like kind of filling that in so that people can kind of take ownership and take pride in what they're learning and what they're sharing, because I think that is a huge deal. And the more that we're able to kind of be honest and upfront of like, oh, like I messed up, or, you know, people are always, or like normalize asking for extensions if that's what you need, or normal, you know, like having those conversations up front, because what it does, if you gatekeep accidentally, especially for a first gen student or for someone that just doesn't have that experience, where I remember I was in graduate school in my last semester and I learned about extensions. And I remember I was sitting there and I was like, wait a minute. You mean to tell me all of y'all, and thinking like to all of my former classes, have emailed the professor and asked for more time and they said yes? Like, what? Like, it just blew my mind. And I was just like, I would have I never thought to do that, because I thought that I had to figure it out, right? Like, and the more that, you know, we're able to create these spaces of like, no, like I understand life happens, right? Like having people that tell you that, and so you're less scared of like, I'm sorry that I was late, or that are panicking, you know, all this stuff, or like I couldn't do this, or my family has COVID, right? Like we're living in a pandemic, and so the more like genuine compassion and honesty that we're able to share, and then like also create space for learning and educating. I don't know. So that's just my rant of like how much we're able to like create spaces of like authenticity, and then also saying like in that authenticity lives academia too, right? I think that there's ways in which when we think of what a professor looks like, or what a teacher looks like, or what a smart person looks like, it's like textbooks and the library. But it's like I also get so much wisdom from just having a conversation with my parents, right? I get so much wisdom from reading a book that's a memoir, not necessarily like a scholarly text, but it's just like those are also valuable pieces of knowledge. And the more they were able to say, I learned just as much from the Michelle Obama memoir as I did from, you know, like my thesis book or whatever, like being able to say like both of these are teaching tools. And so also kind of like destigmatizing or like elevating again this idea of like what is scholarship, and kind of saying like everything counts, everything is a go, so there's no way that anyone has anything more than you, because we all have a lived experience, right? So that's my 2 cents.
That is juicy. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many connections that I'm making to what you're saying. So I guess maybe I'll do this by sharing my attempt. How about that? Because I recognize that when you're in a position of leadership too, you have a certain type of positional authority to create culture, to create norms, to really design and influence space. And so I'm really cognizant of that in my own role as even, you know, working with Latinx Ed. And what I'm thinking about, especially even just the question of how do we create and design spaces that combat imposter syndrome and all the other isms, it's radical to be doing what we're doing and to be leaning into designing something that does not look like what we've experienced too. A lot of it requiring a lot of imagination, because to your point, even in that example of not knowing that extensions were a thing, like it takes imagination also when you don't know that it's a thing to imagine that it could be a thing, right? So really getting in touch with what Dr. Bettina Love calls freedom dreaming, of like trying
Yes,
to dream,
Dr. Love.
right? Dr. Love coming through always with the real talk, but the world without all of these isms that we've been conditioned to accept, like dreaming of what it's like to be free of that is truly quite the exercise, right? Like that is another thing that's not for the faint of heart, but it's also so important. And when we have the privilege to do that and to create and design spaces for other people, how are we moving intentionally with deep self-awareness and also just leaning into that choice and intentionality? So for me, one thing I've been trying out with my staff, you know, and again, God bless my staff for putting up with me and all the things I try to do in creating space, but I do really believe that there are some fundamental things that need to be in a space to allow people to show up as their authentic selves. And three things I've been kind of playing around with and how they manifest in the day-to-day is it starts with radical for each piece, but radical transparency. So being able to communicate what's going on with you, like that's and kind of you manifested that, Marcella, in a few examples of like asking for help, talking about what you're going through. Maybe something happened in your day, in your life, but that's okay to bring in, especially for our workspace, that you can be your authentic self and what you're going through that day, and we can collectively either take care of each other in that process. But that radical transparency, yo, like that's so important. Radical responsibility, which is one that is like so interesting because it's essentially taking responsibility for how you're showing up, even not just for the task or what you're trying to do or what you're trying to get students to do, but
Right.
for, you know, encouraging everyone to show up, taking responsibility for even how they are showing up, and going through that process and just being aware of that piece. And the last one, very important, is radical self-care. How are we taking care of ourselves? How are we nurturing our bodies and putting our needs, especially those needs, first? And that's such a radical, you know, experience for me, at least, like the idea of like, I need to go on a run before I, start my day. Like, I'm like, what? No, I don't have time for a run. I don't have time for these things. Like, I can talk myself out of it so quickly. But then if I
Right.
really get to the heart of it, I'm like, God, what are ways that I am taking care of myself? And so often, if I'm not, there was a question that one of my coaches asked me, and she was like, are you willing to be the most important person in your life? And I was like, whew, that's a great question. Because I am so, I feel like I was wired based on how I was socialized to take care of everybody else. But I really, really struggle with taking care of myself and putting my needs first. And then on top of that, my brain knows that if I take care of myself, then I'm able to take care of others better too. So why am I
Right.
not prioritizing my needs? So it is a journey, and it's still a challenge that I'm unpacking, but it's exciting to be on this, of where now not only am I on this journey, but I'm trying to create a culture where other people can also be on that journey towards freedom. Right?
Right.
It's not about production, it's about freedom. And if we took that mindset and apply that to the classroom and to the learning space of like, how are we working towards the freedom to be our truest selves, and allow, creating that space that really nurtures that in students, and then on top of that, Latinx students from the South. What? So that is what we are trying to do but it starts with us. That's the other piece I think about when we're in the educator role, the facilitator role. We have to do the internal work for ourselves first, and that's a really important part of the journey, to get then be able to create spaces for others. So it's very much a reflection of what I'm going through too. I'm trying to work on myself and my own growth. But that was a juicy question, because woof, there's we all, the growth and the healing that can happen from that is so essential, so important, to feeling like we can do, to be a collective too. So gosh, here we go. Only 3 minutes over. Let's go. Let me sneak into this chat really quick. Just resonating a lot with what is being said. Marcella, thank you so much for joining. I feel like if you have any closing words, feel free to get them in here. But I want to thank you for showing up and for sharing and being so vulnerable with us on what your journey has been. That is such a gift, to be able to receive from you. So I'm just really grateful for you, and just grateful for our friendship, for our hermandad, everything. I am so, I always say, I hope y'all have a Marcella in your life, because it's a game changer. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. I think it is so exciting. And I always talk about, like, if I ever need a pep talk, I call Elaine, because it's true that, like, there's so many, like, there's haters in the world, right? People, mal de ojo is true. People are out here just like putting bad vibes out there. But it's so important to have people on your team that get your vision, so that when you have those moments of failure, of like doubt, of someone not being a radical thinker and saying like, no, that's not how we do it, so we're not going to allow it. That's not what professors look like. That's not what classes should be. And like having that environment, or that's not what North Carolina should look like. Being able to call someone and be like, all right, I think I'm going to stop. And then having that person say, no, keep going, actually double down 3 times. And this is how I'm going to help you and pour into you. And so that has been what's been so beautiful about our friendship, is that I think that we have like similar ideas of like the vision that we have of North Carolina. And I have other folks in my life too, that it's like, what would it be to raise this next generation as like agents of their own lives in a way that I don't think we had access to? And so being able to be a part of that has been super great. And I think my main thing that I always like to tell people is, I had a mentor one time tell me, like, the grass is not greener on the other side. The grass is greener where you water it. And so this idea of like really watering your grass and really fostering your own growth and really taking care of yourself, your community, your environment, because like, and if that means taking a break, right? Like that is going to help your community in the long run. Because if you need the day to survive the week, if you need the week to survive the month, if you need to take the whole month off so that you can survive the year, do it, because we need you for the long term, not for the short term, right? So taking those breaks is so important, because again, it sounds like you're being lazy or whatever other words we put in our own like heads because we don't allow ourselves to do it. But the more that you're able to say, no, I'm doing this because it's going to be better for me and my family and my community and whatever, because then you get to show up as your fullest self and then asking for help when you can. So water your grass, take care of yourself, take the rest. We're in a global pandemic. I cannot stress that enough. People want to go about as business as usual, but if you are so tired you couldn't stay for the whole Zoom event, that's fine, right? Like if you need to be off camera because you just cannot do that anymore, do what you need to do to take care of yourself because we need you here for the long haul. So thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful and so excited, so energized by this. So I really am appreciative.
That's so beautiful. Yet let them know rest is productive. Yes. I'm like, if the real talk, okay, y'all, take that away, please. Thank you so much, Marcel, and thank you so much to everybody for tuning in and engaging and for your questions. We are eager to continue the conversation, so stay tuned. We have already more cafecitos, so join us again. But thank you for showing up and for your support. All right, lots of love, everybody.
Bye, cuídense.
Bye.